All right. So I'm joined now by Africa political commentator, Mr. Joseph Ochieno, who joins us live from Kampala in Uganda. Mr. Ochieno, a good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. My goodness, so much to talk about. The comments made by the president of Rwanda. South Africa dares to issue threats. We will see what threats they are really talking about. And then the message on X last night. I mean, your immediate thought, seeing some of those messages coming from the Rwandan president?
Thanks for having me. I have been following events in Congo, same as events in this country, Uganda. I have been following since a young student events in Southern Africa, including the lead end of apartheid. And I can tell you that I would not expect that in this day and age, in fact, 2025, it would have a Rwandan president make the kind of observations and statements that Paul Kagame has made in response to South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, regardless of the contents, regardless of the context, because in any case, actually thought that considering that it's South Africans who died in Rwanda, and these were peacekeepers, and they died in who died in Congo, and these were peacekeepers, and their presence there was formalized, and considering the fact that Congo is an independent and sovereign nation state, where any presence at the moment of official Rwandan forces, would be seen, if you like, as an intrusion, because the Rwandese, as an army, are not welcome in that side. So I'm not quite sure who should be questioning the legitimacy of the other. But of course, granted, Paul Kagame has got his legitimate concerns because he's a neighbor to Congo. He's got his legitimate concern, allegedly, because he refers to Rwandese rebels who are actually based in Congo. But in the last few days, whatever has happened, tells you that Rwanda, which 30 years ago is a nation that emerged out of a genocide, may have done its mathematics domestically right and strategically within the region in equally right, in a manner in which perhaps they're able to speak like now and call the plug of the rest of the region. Unfortunately, because it involves really now the heart of Africa, which is the DR Congo, with the huge exploitation of resources there and huge amount of humanitarian crisis in that country, I think I find that statement reasonably unacceptable.
Yeah, there's something to be said about relations across the various countries. Uganda, obviously, an important country as well, in the midst of some of the regional tensions. And I'm keen to hear, what sort of messaging should be coming from Uganda at this time.
I think the best that Uganda has done thus far is to keep quiet. And I think the person enjoying the entirety of this is Mr. Museveni. We know, and it's common knowledge, that the two parties in Congo who are not really welcome are Uganda and Rwanda. And it's almost certainly evident that both countries have reasonable presence and interest in Congo, which are actively fueling the conflict. So from Uganda's president's perspective, for Uganda's perspective, the silence basically does them diplomatic favor. In terms of practicalities on the ground, Uganda alleges that in Congo, there are Ugandan rebels, and just like Rwanda does claim. In others, I want to say that it's common knowledge that both Rwanda and Uganda are involved in these conflicts, and they're parties to these conflicts. In any case, President Kagame the other week was making a much more reasonable observation that M23 were last settled in Uganda, and so therefore, why wasn't Uganda being accused? That he was slightly much more reasonable on that. And to that, it's true that M23 rebels, following the peace talks and settlements of about 10 or so years ago, these guys were repatriated and settled in Uganda. How these people left Uganda, how they left with equipment, and why they left, today, nobody asked that. And our SADC leaders are meeting soon to have this conversation. I hope they, table that as one of the key questions. Why I'm saying that is really this Congolese conflict is not about Congolese people. And this Congolese conflict is also not about, really unfortunately, South Africa that may have been found within this context, having peacekeepers there. this is a continental conflict that should not be happening today, following our independence and following the massacre of Patrice Lumumba and following what we know is happening and following the statements and comments by the likes of President Trump. Africa should be putting its house in order. And SADC and East African communities that really should have been the leaders in this day and age over this. Quite clearly, some of their member states are involved, not only in the direct exploitation, use and abuse, including rape of our people, but some of them are quite clearly acquiescent in the exploitation of resources of the sub-region, meaning they're basically agents of external forces, and it defeats the object for the liberation struggles that this continent has struggled for, and the state in which the richest continent it finds itself at a time when the rest of the world is looking at us as a laughing stock.
I mean, that's an interesting point that you make there around the role of the SADC mission, and that these countries in Southern Africa themselves, and I'm also trying to find the words that you would use there, that yes, and we use the words peacekeeper a lot in this context, but you talk about how they also, your words, and you can clarify for me, agents of external forces. And these are some of the words that were used by President Kagame. The SADC is not a peacekeeping force, and it has no place in this situation. It was authorized by SADC as a belligerent force engaging in offensive combat operations to help the DRC government fight against its own people, working alongside genocidal armed groups like the FDLR, which target Rwanda while also threatening to take the war to Rwanda itself. Now SADC is set to meet tomorrow. What's the ideal sort of discussion that they need to have that, brings the pH levels down in this entire tension?
No, and I can tell you that when I was referring to external forces, I was definitely not talking about SADC forces, nor was I talking about any African forces here. I'm actually talking about forces from outside Africa, and those forces are not really forces like the mercenaries. I'm talking about strategic geopolitical forces. Maybe I'm using a mild term, the new colonial forces that were in part contributors to the genocide in Rwanda, the new colonial forces that were in part responsible for the massacre of Patrice Lumumba, and in part some of those forces that have continued to help the destabilization of African continent in the broadest sense are the external forces I'm talking of today. Yeah. And I don't think the agents of those today are found in SADC. The agents of those today are found within our own region. And so, number two, SADC, as it were, is in this region legitimately. In any case, actually, had it not been the leadership of SADC, in 30 years ago, 1997 or thereabout, Congo was almost certainly on the brink of being taken over by forces from Uganda and Rwanda. And I'm reluctantly referring to this back then because, as a matter of fact, this is a continuation of the process. This thing did not start with M23. So the interest in Congo by African countries that should be contributing to stabilizing Congo and giving Congo capacity post-Patrice Lumumba and post Mobutu seem to be the forces that are also joining other external forces to push for economic and, if you like, geopolitical strategic interest in the region. Yeah. Granted, Rwanda accuses Congo of holding what they call genocidal forces post-1993, 1984, 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Granted, the Banyarwanda Hutus who crossed into Rwanda. Yes, if those are there and they're actually a threat to President Kagame, then why don't we have a settlement in which we have Rwandese rebels in Congo, together with M23, who are backed by Rwanda, almost effectively, in Congo, and at the same time, Ugandan rebels allegedly in Congo, if backed by Congo, also together with Ugandan forces in Congo, meaning Uganda, Rwanda, Congo, and then the related belligerent forces down there be part of the conversation. We can't pick and choose. We can't pick M23, as the victim, and we forget about the sovereignty of Congo, and we forget about, if you like, the grievances of all the other rebel groups. I think we shall be picking and choosing. In any case, I think we are playing, games of a sport little kid in an environment in which the little kid has become too big to be checked and too big to be taught discipline. At the end of the day, the issue on the table is the livelihood of an entire household. And that is the livelihood of Africa. And today, it's really about the sovereignty of Congo.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting point to see then what the outcomes are of when SADC meets tomorrow, the 31st of January. And on the agenda is expected by some is that there'll be whether or not to withdraw the military force from the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Should they withdraw?
At the moment, I think any withdrawal that leaves a very weak Congolese state and very weak Congolese armed forces would be a betrayal to the Congolese people. I think SADC was quite resolved, as I said, 30 years ago, and they saved Congo. And I think SADC leaders need to stake their position and I think stick to their position, as it were. It's unfortunate, I think, what part of what Paul Kagame was saying, that maybe SADC surprisingly not see some of these things coming. So where were they 1 year ago? Where were they 12 months ago? Where were they, if you like, 5 years ago? Knowing very well that the other side has been planning, and since 1997 or thereabout, never really settled. So I'm not sure it should really be about a withdrawal, because a withdrawal would mean almost certainly an occupation, a formal occupation, and if you like, a formal occupation of a particular part of Congo. Now, while that may be a question of sovereignty for Congolese, for which I would have no say, but as an African I do, it would have huge implications, because at the moment the atrocities that are taking place there involving Congolese nationalities of other identities, is a matter that cannot be taken lightly. In any case, actually, it's interesting, the governor of Goma was killed, leading to the capture of Goma. And who killed this governor? We can go on and on. No, I think whatever is going to be the future must involve a continuation of support for the Congolese authorities. But at the same time, Congo also needs to be pushed. The Congolese authorities need to be seen to be doing their bit. In fact, part of the arguments that President Kagame raises is also fair and legitimate, that if the M23 rebels and their relatives in DR Congo have got grievances, these grievances should also be put on the table. But what we know is the Congo, the rather weak Congo state, the rather big and weak but yet rich Congo state, does not really have huge amount of control in the east. Interestingly, I must say this, that in the 60s, Ugandan President, then Prime Minister Milton Obote, ought to support the Lumumbist forces in Congo at the time after the killing of Patrice Lumumba. But they're supporting these pro-Africanist forces in Congo to give them capacity rather than to exploit. I think what needs to be done with Congo is to support the Congolese state to be able to have the capacity to control Congo as a nation state, while at the same time having a conversation and encouraging them to resolve their internal grievances.
So important, Mr. Ochieno. I want to look at a few headlines from South Africa and even abroad today. One of them from the Times Live, for instance, reads, "Bring it on. Rwanda's Kagame calls Ramaphosa a liar and dares him to a fight." BBC, for instance, going with South Africa and Rwanda go head-to-head over DR Congo war. I'm starting to wonder where you have now tensions brewing between South Africa and Rwanda. There have been some issues there, I think, in the past, as we've seen before. But now some of them really coming to a head, a concern about whether or not this could be an expanding tension. What does President Cyril Ramaphosa need to do? And perhaps you have a view on just the posture that he has put forward in the interactions with President Kagame. Some, of course, arguing that South Africa's troops that are in the DRC at the moment are there as part of a SADC mission. And so the interaction needs to be between Kagame and SADC. But conversations happening between Ramaphosa and Kagame, what do you make of that, and particular concerns that you might have about those relations?
I think there's possibly quite a lot that can be said, and I'm not sure whether some of them are possibly used for the purposes of the ongoing discussions. Of course, South Africa and Rwanda have a history. The almost apparent humiliation of South Africa, when South African soil was used by, when Rwandan descendants in South Africa where, where we're compromised, the lives were compromised in South Africa. As I said, I didn't think that such a thing would happen because I thought South Africa is our respected elder state, as it were. But for President Ramaphosa, I think it's a rather difficult situation. One, of course, is that his citizens have died, regardless of the circumstances. But number two is also quite clearly the case. You're absolutely right that the matter of SADC, SADC should be formally the lead voice, as far as whatever will have happened in Congo. But South Africa, as a leader nation or any other responsible nation state, who's lost is citizens, and the challenges that the ANC government had in recent times, I think it's absolutely in the interest of the president to come out and speak on behalf of his country, but also on behalf of his region. But it also has got a mandate to be able to explain the circumstances under which South African lives are lost abroad. And that's what I'm saying. It's really unfortunate that this is happening, not only in Rwanda, but in a manner in which actually South Africa seems to be being forced on the defensive, in a manner in which I think is rather unfair and unreasonable.
Yeah, Mr. Joseph Ochieno, an absolute pleasure speaking to you. I imagine we'll be chatting some more in the near future. Mr. Joseph Ochieno, the Africa political commentator, speaking to us from Kampala in Uganda.